here now. Welcome back. Melissa, it's all yours. I'm trying to spotlight Ann Sussman as well, so that we can see her. Is everybody spotlit? I believe everybody's spotlit.
Now I'm only seeing Ann. I think you need to make sure that you...
Richard, you want to turn on so you'll be spotlit, please? And Anna Brilman, where are you? Are you still here? Is Anna here?
I am still here. I'm now on my phone's internet connection and hoping that this might drop. I might be out for a sec, but I'm gonna be back for sure. Internet issues.
Okay. So I think we're all spotlit, except for Richard with his eternal smile.
And do you know if Victoria has joined us yet? I know she was going to be a little bit late.
I think she's traveling around the universe.
Okay.
But she'll be back.
But he's not spotlighted. I don't even see his.
He's not on.
Oh, he's not on at all. Okay. And Matt, did you find Matt? He was there before.
Matt.
And
Charlie. Beautiful, beautiful background.
Yeah, Matt's in a theater.
Somebody's in a civilized place.
We get Charlie.
Charlie, where's Charlie? Okay, so our limit is 9. This is really nuts. Why
don't you not spotlight me? I'm okay being a voice in the background here if you need to get all the panelists on here. 1, 2, 3.
Okay. So let's get Charlie here.
Perfect. And we got Nikos? Yes, we have Nikos back. But not Richard.
Richard? I'm not sure where he is.
Okay.
He'll show up. He always shows up.
Okay.
Maybe he's out surfing.
Yeah. Okay. So should we begin? For those of you who don't know me, I know I'm now a disembodied voice from the ether. I'm Melissa DelVecchio. I'm a partner at Robert Stern Architects, where I work on a lot of educational and institutional projects. I've been there for 20 years. I profess no expertise in this topic, just a keen developing interest, probably in part because I am the child of a physicist and an art teacher. So someone who is thinking about the arts and talking about the cognitive development of children around the dinner table, and someone who is constantly bringing up geeky math topics. And so I think that's a little bit of where my interest comes from. And I think I'm also very much interested because I've always felt that architecture suffered from its own self-referential thinking. And I have seen now in my institutional work at colleges and universities more and more interest in cross-disciplinary studies. And I think a conversation like this and what we just heard from Nikos really shows the value of when artists and mathematicians and psychologists and different kinds of scientists come together to really research issues together and not to just sit in their own worlds and think about their own disciplines. So I look forward to what should be an interesting discussion amongst us all today. And I think the goal is to not only talk about the things that Nikos raised here today with regards to architecture, but also to link this to crafts and craftspeople and the physical and mental well-being of people in those professions and how they relate to their own work and how that helps them. And this is just showing, I guess Nir's now showing some of slides of my work. This is a recent project that we just did at Yale University. It was partly a historic restoration and renovation of the Commons building, a Carrera and Hastings building from 1901, where we were also able to add to the building and create some new spaces underground and above ground. And I've also worked a lot with one of our panelists here at Zoltan. So this is some of the new spaces at the lower level. And So I think now I will share my screen and I'll go through each of the panelists. And if you all, I have a slide just like Mir was showing for me. I have slides for all of you.
Now, when do I turn off all this good stuff?
I think when I start sharing.
Oh, here it is. I found it.
Go away.
It's
So
hiding.
are you
All
all
right, thank you.
seeing? Are you all seeing my screen now?
Apparently.
Yes, just not quite in presenter mode yet.
Okay, there we go. So I'm going to go through each of the panelists and they can introduce themselves. I think Nikos has already had his introduction before his talk. Oh, I didn't realize I was in here. You've seen my thing. So Anna Brielman.
Yes, hello. My name is Anna Brielman. I am a psychologist and vision scientist by training. I'm incredibly grateful to be here because my work is usually computational, quantitative, and sometimes very theoretical. My upbringing in experimental psychology was very much focused on how we experience the visual work, and I've continued that throughout my PhD studies, where I focus specifically on how we experience beauty around us, specifically again in the visual domain. And I'm now in Tübingen pursuing this with a more computational focus. So you would call me a computational cognitive neuroscience if you want to be fancy. And as Nir and Nikos have mentioned, I've had the honor to work with them on this multidisciplinary project on trying to knit together insights from vision science, psychology, cognitive sciences, and neurosciences to inform how to build better and more beautiful environments. So if you want to humor me in that little contribution there on the side, I've also dabbled in art school for a bit. So there's a creative side to me that very much still informs my research as well. And yeah, as an illustration, this one, I think it's still an uphill battle that we're sort of fighting, getting to know each other as interdisciplinary colleagues. But I think it's going to be worthwhile and all downhill from there.
Anne, why don't you tell us more about you?
Oh, hey, well, I'm Anne. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you. This is such important work. I'm president of the Human Architecture and Planning Institute, and what we're trying to do there is get people to understand people better so we can design better places for them. There are new technologies around like 3M visual attention software, which Nir talked about, which once you start playing with them, you'll see not just your world, you'll see yourself differently. I think one of the frightening things that I see is that the car companies, the tech companies, the advertising companies understand people. They use the latest technologies. They use eye tracking, facial expression analysis, galvanic skin response to promote more consumption and to direct the consumer. They don't quibble with evolution. They buy it and they use it. The architectural establishment, the planning establishment is completely ignorant. It's like we're having two, what can I say? It's 2 centuries at once. It's kind of mind numbing. And so I think together we can change that. We need to know that the car companies, the power of like the iMotion software that they use for their ads, for their car design is just absolutely amazing. So the technologies are all here to deconstruct the human experience entirely and to understand why traditional architecture works and why modern architecture cannot. But the funding to get this to happen and to make us build healthy places for people, that whole pieces, those pieces are missing. So I'd love to talk with you guys about how we can change that. What you're doing is great. This is a first step, and I'm thrilled to see my co-board member, Dawn Ruggles, will be also speaking. Oh, and this is some of the, I can explain if you go in the past slide, the slide before, it's some of the books our members have put out, including Dawn's book and my books, Cognitive Architecture, Urban Experience Design. The Cognitive Architecture, the second edition, which came out in July, I will say this, it is the first book in history with 40 full color images of eye-tracked architecture. It's really important we introduce this new technology so people understand people's impact of the built environment right now. Right now, this technology is actively used to promote consumption. It's not being used to promote health or well-being, and we want to change that. Next slide. And then, so basically, and when I give my talks, we often talk about the human unconscious, understanding it. Now we can track it. We talk about biometric modeling, basically it's stuff that we've talked about already. And I look forward to talking about this more with you.
Charlie, we can't hear anything.
It's still a little soft. It's better than it was with your headphones in, but you might have to move a little closer. Charlie's trying to work in his studio with a model while he's talking to us.
Yeah, well, how about now? Is it better?
A little bit better, maybe speak up a bit.
Sure. A figurative sculptor, and I'm working with Stephen Howard to make the National World War I Memorial. So we're sculpting 38 figures. In clay, it'll be cast in bronze and installed 150 yards from the White House. I'm a traditional figure sculptor. We work with clay, and I work with a live model every day. And I'm here in the studio to show you what I'm working on, a sculpture in progress. So interested in this whole topic because, you know, while we're working, it's totally a physical act, but it's also we're engaged mentally the whole time. So I'm excited to hear from all the different panelists and kind of cross-pollinate the ideas.
Great. Dawn, please introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your movie, which we'll be screening next.
Thank you. What an honor to be amongst such incredible professionals today. Just completely honored to be part of this group. I'm a practicing architect, have been for over 50 years. And in recent years, I started to realize there was a connection between the research that was going on in the neuroscience world and how it could apply to architecture. And particularly focused on the word beauty and trying to bring back that concept into architecture, which has frankly been a banned concept since the early 1900s. And beauty is a pleasure response. I mean, plain and simple, despite all the complications of the word beauty, if you change up the notation and say it's a pleasure response, people start to look at it slightly differently. And pleasure is an important part of our human physiology. We seek balance in our life. When we're overstressed, we seek to reduce the stress, or when we're ill, we seek to remedy the illness. We're always looking for balance. Well, part of that balance is pleasure working with stress. And stress is an important part of our life, but only in short bursts, because it keeps our neurological system active and built up, strong, if you will. So pleasure reduces the negative aspects of stress, but stress keeps us strong. So those two things working together are known as homeostasis. And that's why I think that bringing beauty and pleasure back to architecture is so important. Literally, our health and well-being rests upon it. So that's what I've been focused on in the movie that we're going to show a little bit later is also focused on. And Anne and Nikos were really an important part of not just having the movie made, but also the whole effort of bringing these ideas to the forefront. So I look forward to joining in the discussion.
Thank you. John?
Okay, thank you very much for including me. This is quite an honor. I admire so much of your work. I'm usually reading rather than writing. Last summer was a big Ian McGilchrist summer for me. And of course, he comes up again in the Brazilian production. So I'm right about mathematically in the middle of the United States in Atchison, Kansas, quite near Kansas City. And we are in year 6 of starting a classical, still in the startup phase, a classical architecture program. Based on sort of, an earlier, scrappier, sort of simpler version of Notre Dame, a graduate from Notre Dame. So the president of this college wanted to bring that spirit here. So everything is done by hand. we are very much beauty first, ornament first, and a little bit of that is just trying to find our strengths with no past, with no history. And we were started as an idea sandwiched between the existing art and engineering programs here. And for that, the students were getting into engineering projects and theory that they could not bring into the studio. And the art was a little bit too far in the other direction. So we've been carving out who we are kind of blessedly, quietly, not on a whole lot of people's radar. We are a 4-year program, pre-professional. I've been in contact with old friends from the University of Notre Dame, and I got some very good advice by one who said, watch out for that NAAB accreditation. No, because she had worked for a number of years on that committee, and know that they are not looking for compliance, but conformity. And I thought that's just something really that we'll hold on to for a while before we try to jump into an accredited program. So what does that allow us to do in the meantime? Well, it allows me to be in touch with many old friends and find out, okay, well, what was on the schedule of studies at Columbia 120 years ago? A semester of ornament. Okay, we're not quite doing that, but certainly beauty matters and ornament matters to our program. We do in their introduction to architecture class, which I teach, our 4 books are, of course, Vitruvius, but also Corbusier. The students are allowed to study those texts and look at the work produced out of them across the ages or decades, and ask, okay, well, which one seems more sane? Which one seems more or more mad? And of course, one of the books that Ian McGilchrist recommends that we read, it's a little thick, is the Madness and Modernism. But the students can see that even in the expression of the work and the product that's coming out of there. We, of course, have Roger Scruton, Why Beauty Matters, and then Elaine de Botton, Architecture, the Architecture of Happiness, so that the students start to learn what are the questions they're allowed to ask in this field. And if they're going to be putting so much effort into this major, why not have almost every project be also a work of art? And certain of the parents end up framing their kids' work, whether or not that's ultimately healthy, I'm not sure. But anyway, it's beautiful in its own right, and they're proud of what they're doing here. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Mark, tell us a little bit
Yes,
about your
can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Good. This slide is showing me with one of my 8 books. I'm an architect, practicing architect. I'm a musician. I'm also a traditional woodworker, but I do a lot of writing on the history of architecture, particularly architectural practice. And I do a little with historic preservation, which is my practice is focused on historic preservation. So one of my latest books is called Draw in Order to See, A Cognitive History of Architectural Design. I think it's the first history of architecture that really talks about how architects think when they make buildings. And of course, when the earliest humans made buildings, they made them with their hands. They actually dug them out of the ground, a little bit like animals. And eventually we got to the point where we started drawing them. And drawing, of course, by hand also connects us to the making or the crafting of things. So in my book, I spend a good deal of time talking about hand craftsmanship and how the hand and the eye allows us to appreciate beauty. I then got involved fairly recently with people in San Diego at the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture. I'm on their education committee, a lot of interesting people on that committee who are trying to help architecture schools start programs that will introduce courses in neuroscience of design, which is my specialty, but also the neuroscience of beauty. And so I'm hopeful that my participating in this group, as well as in some other groups, can bring those scientific things to bear on the art of architecture. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, let's go ahead.
Oh,
That's my book. Sorry, that's my book. Draw in order to see. And if you read a little bit of what's on the screen, you'll see that it talks about how Homo sapiens began to make their habitats. I talk about 3 cognitive arcs. Really, from the Neolithic to the Renaissance, we were craftsmen. We were artisans. Architects were only artisans. We didn't really draw much. We made things. In the Renaissance, we learned how to draw and use the concept of disegno to form visual judgment, which we used, I think, actually up until about 1900. Around 1900, we started to look at buildings as machines that could be assembled. The assembling paradigm, I think, has hurt architecture. It's drawn us into an engineering, a kind of algorithmic way of looking at design. So I make a plea to go back at least to hand drawing and to hand craftsmanship and to artisanship in this book.
Matt.
Hi, I'm Matt McNicholas. I'm incredibly privileged and honored to be here with you all, and excited about the topic. So much so that it's hard to sleep. But I'm principal of McNicholas Architects, MGLM, and we're based in Chicago. I specialize in ornament, essentially eat, sleep, and breathe it. Primarily designing ornament, but also research and writing on it as an expression of beauty and architecture in the built environment. I presented to various groups from Greenbuild to the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture and ICAA chapters nationwide on architectural ornament and neuroscience. The die was cast for me regarding architecture and ornament during my first visit to Louis Sullivan's Auditorium Theater, which you can see behind me here. If you haven't had a chance to visit it, please come to Chicago and check it out. It's a masterpiece. But I was only 12, and now I find myself lucky to be on the board there and chair of the facilities committee as we undertake renovation of the theater. I'm also a diehard naturalist, amateur botanist, frustrated scientist. I'm captivated with the way we perceive and organize the world, and want to make sure that is reflected in not just our work, but all traditional work. My mother and father were a psychologist and an attorney, respectively, and so I find myself in this constant mode of researching and building an unassailable argument for ornament. And I'm addicted to nature herself, really, and I feel like buildings must reflect the organized complexity and emulate the details of the natural world in order to provide the greatest benefit to humans.
Richard, are you back with us?
I am. Yeah. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Yes, I'm Richard Taylor from University of Oregon in Eugene on the West Coast. And I always feel that when I give a talk, I'm really introducing Nikos. And sometimes when Nikos gives his talks, he's introducing me. So thank you for that introduction, Nikos. We're so intertwined. And as Nikos mentioned, something about fractals. And so I've made a career of studying fractals, and in particular bioinspiration. You know, how can we look and learn from nature and how it uses fractals, and then apply that to an artificial environment. And I've done that in many different disciplines, from the painter Jackson Pollock through to bionic eyes. But the most impactful one is studies like this, where essentially I've been working with psychologists for 20 years, developing a model called fractal fluency, which, as Nikos explained, is really as simple as that. It's saying that through evolution, our visual systems have evolved to process fractal patterns effortlessly, and we call it effortless looking. And I've used eye tracking and EEG and MRI to quantify the positive effects that you get out of them, and they're quite dramatic. So looking at the right type of fractal pattern will reduce your stress levels by up to 60%. So more recently, I'm thinking about how to take that, sort of very scholarly academic idea of fractal fluency and work with people like you, designers and architects, to incorporate it into the built environment. And so far I've been considering interiors. So here you see a collaboration with a carpet manufacturer called Mohawk Group. And so they're installing fractal carpets actually around the world. And I'm working with another group called Fact Design doing noise reducing ceiling tiles as well. And we've considered fractal solar panels. So kind of this idea that we can gradually, bit by bit, incorporate these stress reducing fractals into the interior environment.
Okay.
And that's Jackson Pollock. And there's my bionic eye project.
And I think Victoria is not with us yet, but maybe, are you here, Victoria? Maybe not. So hopefully you can read a little bit about Victoria here for just a moment. Hopefully she will join in at some point. She was a late addition to the panel group here, but some beautiful drawings and work of hers.
Yeah, Victoria is doing a PhD on the sublime, that side of the universe. If you're coming from the understanding of truth, goodness, and beauty, you recognize the two emotions being love and fear. And fundamentally, the neuroaesthetic experience of beauty is related with the love side of the universe, and the sublime, fear-based aesthetic experience on the other. And we can say that the modern world, which started sometime around 1750, really came with this recognition of the sublime as being a kind of a part of a causative force equal to the good and the beautiful. And the 19th and 20th centuries have all been experiments with regard to that, the 19th being backward looking and the 20th being forward looking, in both cases, to fictitious histories and fictitious futures. That is the romantic predicament, and we are at the end of the 2nd century of romantic life with the sublime running the dystopian visions that most people get to see of the future. I hope that was entertaining. Sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you. Absolutely. So thank you for that, Nir. Zoltan, I think you're maybe the last one in the group here.
Thank you for having me. My name is Zoltan Kovács. I'm a trained metallurgical engineer and also a blacksmith and craftsman. I was wondering what I'm gonna talk about it and how am I connected to the neuroscience and listening Nico's presentation, which I was fascinated by. I learned that about myself, that I'm really into this topic. And just listening the keywords like working with hands, doing drawings, fractals and ornaments. So I learned about myself that I really connected into this topic. Yes, Tony. So studying myself from the perspective of this topic, I learned that how important it was to me to switch from engineering, metallurgy engineering, to craft and switch to art and design, and how my life changed. I was attending to watercolor classes at the Art League of New York. I learned about myself, how can I draw, how can I create, and how happy it makes me. Starting from design, how important is for me to be on the hands-on and creating something and enjoying creating something. So this is a very interesting topic, and I'm really appreciate I can be here. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for that. Okay, so there are so many different ways to dig into this topic. I sort of don't know where to start. When I don't know where to start, sometimes I go to my the fearless leader and founder of our firm, Bob Stern, who frequently likes to say, particularly when talking about looking up at a big glass skyscraper, that when your eyes are bored, your brain is bored. And it makes me think about the fact that some people seem to intuitively understand these ideas and respond to them. Maybe because some designers have a sort of faith in the accumulated wisdom that we've developed over the centuries, and think about architecture long before architecture became a real profession, it was building based on accumulated knowledge over the centuries and what worked, what was environmentally responsible because it had to be, and what made people happy. And I'm curious, and maybe Mark, you're the person to talk about this if you're studying the profession. Like, when did we lose? It's so interesting to me that we somehow along the way lost this idea of having any faith in what people had been doing before. And I always like to say, we have to take the time to look back if we're going to discover the path forward. And maybe you could talk a little bit about where we lost our way and maybe how now this new technology can help to bring others along with those of us who intuitively sense that this is the right approach.
Well, thanks, Missy. Let me show you first this object here, which is a kana, or hand plane. It's a Japanese hand plane. I've learned to use one of these. And the builders of Chinese and Japanese buildings have been using these planes for probably maybe 1,000 years now, and the design hasn't changed at all. And we lost our way when we stopped thinking about architecture as an artisanal discipline. And actually that occurs in the Enlightenment, first with Descartes and dualism, then with Claude Perrault, when you start to think that architecture can be thought rather than made. And even as the Industrial Revolution begins, Denis Diderot introduces a new concept of the fine arts, in which architecture, the 5 fine arts, in which architecture, which really isn't specifically a fine art only, he essentially contradicts Aristotle and all of the Greek philosophers who looked at artisanship in all of its form: furniture making, pottery, stone cutting, timber building, etc. These were all arts, and there wasn't a difference between the fine arts and the so-called applied arts. When Diderot established the dance and painting and sculpture and architecture and music as fine arts, he essentially gave us this modern notion that somehow, even in a bourgeois sense, that the fine arts were things that could be understood by people who were educated, and that the rest of the people, the kind of unwashed masses, were only interested in things that were applied, and that they could, that the beauty of things that were applied could be appreciated by those who were uneducated, but a painting by Watteau could only be appreciated by educated people, not necessarily aristocrats, but the bourgeoisie, the educated bourgeoisie. At this time, we also found that architects who had done engineering up to that point started to be dissociated from engineers. And engineers were initially, of course, employed in battles. They were designing fortifications, and then in railroads. And they were employed to design things that were useful, but also generally dynamic. Engineers were designing machines. And when engineers were divorced from architects with the foundation of the École Polytechnique and the Ponts et Chaussées in France, the French were the ones who did that, we lost something. Architects were then removed from part of the design of buildings that they were always interested in. If they were making buildings, they had to understand how they worked. They understood how they stood up. Benjamin Henry Latrobe was an engineer and an artist and an architect. He would never have dissociated engineering with architecture. So at that time, things started to fall apart, and eventually we came to look at design as a means of assembling things like machines. And buildings really aren't just assembled. We look at them as wholes. We design them as wholes. The beauty of a building is understood as a whole. Engineers don't look at wholes generally. They may be interested in aesthetics sometimes, but they're interested in a kind of linear process. And design is not a linear process. It's a process of loops between the hand, the eye, and the brain. And architects who understood design as an artisanal process essentially became trapped in this kind of box that we're in right now, where we're supposed to be problem-solving thinkers. We're not just problem solvers or thinkers. We're designers. We're artisans. And until we get back to the idea that we're artisans, we're going to have a problem in this highly specialized technocratic world. And I think that's what this kind of conference allows us to do. Think of ourselves as artisans again. Think of ourselves as craftspeople, people who make things. Connect ourselves with the iron craftsmen, with the woodworkers, with the stone carvers. Now that Notre Dame is doing this, and eventually we'll get back to the fundamentals of our art and our science and our practice. And that's my plea that I try to do in my book.
I'm going to come back to that in a moment, but I also want to talk a little bit about technology in architecture. And I went to Notre Dame as an undergraduate, did a lot of hand drawing, studied classical architecture, then went to Yale for graduate school so that I could figure out everything else, because I realized I was opening up architectural record sometimes and I didn't know how to talk about the buildings that I saw being published there. And I had this funny feeling at the time that architects needed to play out what technology could do for them, what computers could do for them. And there was a lot of what was essentially Baroque form making done by the computer that was happening in a process of exploration. But now that we know what computers can allow us to do, we've done pretty much, well, maybe not everything, but we've done a lot of different things with them. I think now students are starting to question, and the population in general is maybe starting to question, why are we doing those things? Just because you can do those things doesn't mean that you should do those things. And what I'm interested in about what Anne is talking about is it's a different, other professions, advertising and whatnot, are using technology in a different way. They're actually using technology to reach their audience, whereas architects are using technology to do what they feel like is maybe formally interesting. And I'm curious to hear you opine on that thought a bit, Anne.
Well, thanks, Melissa. It's been a great session. It's so important. I think for me, the blank slate idea that Steven Pinker at Harvard has talked about, how the blank slate, the idea is false, but it pervades the social sciences in education in the 20th century. And famous architectural professors at Harvard, like Gropius, would say students were starting from a blank slate. And this idea that we could kind of recreate the world with technology, I think really grows out of war. I mean, look, Gropius was a World War I veteran, right? And for me anyway, I think as I see it, and I know I do see it differently than you guys, a lot of people, but I see modern architecture as a direct expression of the trauma of war. Because when you start looking at the neuroscience tools that the car companies use and the tech companies use, you start seeing that the brain has not just preset, or that your biology is not just preset your breathing and your heart rate before you're born. Your evolution is preset, as Nikos essentially applies, your evolution is preset what you need to see to feel good. Evolution is preset your need for narrative. Evolution is preset your face bias. Evolution is preset your need to feel soothed by ordered complexity. It's all preset. So traditional architecture up until World War I basically is an external reflection of hidden evolutionary biases that secured our survival. So that's why I could go to Siena when I was 23, not speaking any Italian, and feel totally at home there. Something didn't feel right. It makes absolutely no sense. Why do I feel better walking on the old streets of Siena than most streets in America? It made no sense, because it fits biologically what my body needs to see to feel in a place. And it's really not that different. I think when I was 5, anywhere in the world with old architecture. Why? Because it fits our biology. It's preset. And now we have the tech tools that see this. I'm not sure I've answered your question. But for me, when you study trauma, this is the stuff that's actually amazing too. The way trauma impacts the brain, they really didn't understand till the 1990s with magnetic resonance imaging, and how trauma rewires the brain. So someone like Gropius would want to see a blank building where you can't find the front door. Trauma makes your brain face averse. So that's really huge. That's why one reason industrialization made us not want to have detail in buildings, but also trauma. So if Mies, Gropius, Neutra were all World War I vets, we could say they all had PTSD and they were designing for brains that didn't see the world neurotypical. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, that is very interesting.
So you have to understand what the car companies all know. Reality is a construct between your eye and brain, and your hidden brain architecture has already preset what you need to see to want to advance towards something. Got it? And when you use the 3M VAST tool, the reason you can even have a tool like 3M Visual Attention Software is because reality happens at 2 phases. The first phase is subliminal. And this is what's amazing, what 3M will explain to you. The first phase of vision happens irrespective of age, gender, education, culture. It's the same. In fact, I think what the 3M guy told us in his last talk, it's exactly like a monkey's, the first phase. Which makes sense, because I think we share, 98% of our, or 96% of our DNA with monkeys, so it makes sense.
So let's pivot and talk a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about Mark's book, but I think maybe John Hay.
Excuse me, Melissa.
Yeah.
Is anyone looking at the chats to see if there are questions for the panel?
Yes, I'm trying not to get distracted by it, but at the same time, watch it. Am I failing here? Is there something you see in there that you like?
There's a lot of information and conversation, but somebody should be responsible for seeing if there is a specific question that the panel can answer.
Yes, we do have Flora and Tasneem who are watching the chat, and I'm seeing a lot of comments come through, but I haven't been able to watch everything. Tasneem and Flora, have we missed any questions?
Well, there is some questions about, I'll just say one question about symmetry. Symmetry is very healthy. I mean, the big thing that all the tech people know and all the car companies know is perception's relational. We're hardwired for looking at one another because we're a social species. And so everything kind of depends on that, is connected to that. We don't see reality. We see the reality nature wants us to see. And as a social species, we have to see other faces. And symmetrical faces, they know, they've done tests on this already, are viewed as preferable to asymmetrical faces, believe it or not.
I want to add in one tiny thing.
Yeah,
Annie.
I want to read, because I think it's interesting, and the reason why we hand-drawn images, that the perfect symmetry is actually not preferred. This artificial symmetry that does not reflect the symmetry that we see in biology. So it's the imperfect asymmetry, and that again reflects back to what Nico said, right? It's an ordered complexity that we're basically hardwired, that we see all over again in nature and in our experience. And it's not even hardwired in our biology. It's also what we will experience despite modernist architecture. That's still what we see in faces and the landscape. So that's the beauty, I think, of it, is that it's a system that reinforces itself. It need not only be our inbred biology, it's also the environment at large that kind of feeds into that. So it's not, asymmetry is not unhealthy per se.
Also, there are other questions for you. I think folks in the chat are looking for you to expand on those ideas a little bit more in your research and what you're learning from your research.
Yeah, it'd be very interesting to know about some of the psychophysics, the neuroscience of geometry, and some of the research that's going on in Annie's institute. I know in ANFA in San Diego, there are some people who are looking at proportion. Sergei Epstein is doing some work on the brain, the way the brain takes in proportion. Geometry, of course, in fractals. Any of our panelists that could talk a little more about that. It's very interesting to architects when we get information from neuroscience on those kinds of aspects of perception?
I think Anne and I have been looking a lot at 9 square, or the 3x3 diagram, which is a realization of a facial pattern. And we're literally born looking for that pattern. In fact, they've shown that our DNA instructs us to look for it. Babies before they're born have been shown the pattern, and they respond positively in utero to the pattern. So a baby's survival is dependent on finding the 3x3 pattern. Well, that pattern has shown up in our art and architecture for as long as it's been recorded. And it's pretty remarkable. And it doesn't necessarily have to be symmetric. And that's what's even more remarkable, because of pareidolia and the brain's willingness to construct reality, which Anne was just talking about. So we're always looking for this pattern. And in fact, my postulate is when we don't find it, it's stress inducing. And then we're looking for it and we don't find it, and we go on until we do find it. Then that's why we're not looking at blank buildings. So I think one of the patterns that is incredibly significant is 3x3, or otherwise known as the 9 square. I've been avoiding 9 square in my lectures because there's so much academic bias towards that notation that a 3x3 seems like a simpler way to convey the idea.
Annie, do you have anything to add from your research? I think that's what some folks in the chat have been asking for a little.
I can give the very brief, is the expert on fractals, and he knows best what's going on. So that's one of these quote unquote universals that we know, that people prefer certain fractal dimensionality, fractal complexity. And then roundness is a thing, and symmetry, that overall people do prefer and feel drawn towards. So it's not only that we want to look at it and that we want to sadly also buy it, as Anne very well pointed out, right? So industry abuses these principles. It's also something that we actually approach physically. So our hand movements go towards these stimuli, etc. You mentioned proportions as well. That seems a little bit more complicated in the end, because it's always a matter of what objects proportions are we looking at.
So I do want to try to tie this together to the
folks that hate me for it.
Sorry, I do want to tie this together to crafts, because I think there are a lot of really interesting questions coming, but they're very related to the architectural side of Nico's talk. And I think the goal from Nir's perspective is that we try to link this to the craftspeople. And it seemed to me that the place where that crossover happens is in this idea of engagement, Nikos, that you went through so thoroughly in your talk. And I think of it as, it's the same sensation that maybe I get when I'm drawing. So maybe, Mark, this links also to your idea of drawing in order to see things. But, this idea of engagement, hand-eye coordination, and part of your brain and your hand being connected in terms of thinking through a design. And I don't know who's the best to start talking about that. Maybe Nikos, you can say where you think the link is to craft, and then maybe Zoltan and Charlie can tell us how they feel about that idea.
Well, I think the answer to this question was given by Christopher Alexander in The Nature of Order, in a chapter which he calls Wholeness Heals the Maker. Making something with your hands engages certain neuronal circuits and triggers hormonal releases in the human body, so that whoever is making something with her hands is healed. This is a healing experience. And human beings, ever since our ancestors, the monkeys, started to shape a piece of stone or a piece of bone, have profited from this positive experience on the body. So this has been taken away from us now because we just buy everything. We don't make anything.
Can you identify specific research with regard to that, or is it just opinion?
This is one of the open questions that is waiting funding for Ann's Institute, the Happy Institute. We're waiting for $10 million grant from some enlightened industrialist in order to do this research. But we can measure the hormonal levels, and we can measure the high, the positive high that the body gets. The experiments have not been done. But everyone knows.
How would
okay,
you define the experiment? How would you, word it?
Yes, you wire up somebody who is a craftsperson with the very, very light portable equipment, and you have them carve a piece of wood or make something out of clay, and then you see the emotional and the hormonal responses. And that's the same.
Could I break in and talk about the Parma group and canonical and mirror neurons? When mirror neurons were discovered, it really opened up a whole range of things that artists and architects can now look at, because of the way our brain is primed to mimic things in our environment. Monkeys, of course, are when they look at someone who's eating a peanut, the motor neurons in their arms and their hands and their lips and their jaw will start to fire, even though they're not actually eating the peanut. Now, canonical neurons are neurons that are primed when we want to reach for something. Vittorio Gallese has a wonderful talk in which he looks at a coffee cup. And when we look at a coffee cup and we have drunk coffee, the neurons in our arm and our hands are actually reaching for the cup before we actually reach the cup. So if we look at the kinds of things that are within our grasp, what's called parapersonal space, and we look at the way when we make things, when we craft things, and even if we look at things that are crafted, we empathize with the making of those objects. Michelangelo, of course, talked about the body emerging from the stone. An iron craftsman, when he is pounding the noyau to create those crafts that Les Métayers de Champenoise was, when we see those things, our bodies, especially if we can grasp them and we can use them, then there's also the use of the object. So if we're reaching for a gate and the gate has a beautiful and inviting a handle to it, and there's a pattern around it, we're going to be drawn to that gate in ways that we won't be drawn to a non-ornamented gate. When we're near a wall that has relief to it, we're going to be drawn to that wall. So the mirror neurons and canonical neurons and place neurons can help us to understand how the things that we've made will draw us to them, will make us feel better, will engage us aesthetically. There's lots and lots of new research that's actually going on near to these areas. And we know, of course, in programs like Notre Dame, that when students carve stone, they design better stone walls. There's no question about it. I know that our two educators are very aware of that. The making of things, the crafting of things, bringing that back into our world is absolutely essential. And we can test it.
So Zoltan and Charlie, I'm curious what you think about this, because you're the ones who experience these feelings in your work. And it sounds like, at least Zoltan, maybe you can start, that some of these ideas were really new to you as of today. And I'm just curious what your response is.
Yes, and just unmuted myself. And Mark, comments are really exciting. I learned about myself when I creating metalwork designs. If I start on computer, it's not gonna drive me anywhere. I have to have a pencil and a piece of paper in front of me. And in addition to that, I need sections of metal bars in the hand. Feel the edge, feel the weight, compare the two different materials next to each other, how they're gonna look next to each other, how they're gonna form a gate, how they're gonna form a railing. I have to grab a piece of wood for the handrail, for a railing, or a piece of bronze rail cap to feel and touch. Go to the workshop, create textures, create a volute, comparing sizes. So everything draws back to the drafting table. It has to be hands-on. You cannot really relate on computers. You will not feel the proportion at all. And we talked about fractals, and unknowingly, I'm using those details and numbers like the Fibonacci numbers or the golden ratio during designs. When you design a volute, it will be pleasing to the eye when it is following the golden ratio or the Fibonacci numbers. And more you practice and more you finalize your scroll works or drawings, you will find out that there is a balance in the drawings, which is mathematically can be proven that's for human size. I don't know how to explain what I try to explain. I'm not into neuroscience and I'm not into this until today, but I'm really excited about it.
Charlie, do you have anything
Wonderful.
to add about your personal experience making things with reference to what Nikos and Mark have offered?
Yeah. I mean, my thought right now is I'm just so impressed by our ancestors' collective kind of drive in this direction that we're talking about, and the intuition and the feeling to build a culture of people that could make the things that, you know, we as this group like to see, you know. So but then to bring it back to myself, I'm very much there with Zoltan, and I just always avoided the computer and felt the intuition also to work with my hands. And beyond that, the only thing that's different with me is that I've been working with a live model the whole time as well. So I draw from life and I sculpt from life, so that there's another layer to the interaction and the experience that I have when I'm making something, because I'm working with another human being sort of in collaboration with the pose, you know, to make the sculpture. So I'm observing the model in front of me, and then I'm placing and designing the sculpture with that in reference. So I'm directly referencing nature, but it's also a human being and human nature the whole time. And that kind of makes it an even more, you know, I can talk a lot about the experience for me, but I'm also very excited and just interested by this group to hear from you all about when the object then is out in space, how people respond, how my experience transfers into the sculpture, and then how that is read or conditions, you know, the public's experience.
I wonder if Matt could talk a little bit about his the way he draws. He has these drawing workshops in which he uses these large scale drawings to embody. We talk about embodied cognition, to embody the ornament and embody the architecture that he makes. They're very impressive, Matt. I wonder if you could kind of talk about your experience with that kind of creative act where your entire body is involved in the design of these wonderful things that you design.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I look at the computer as sort of a break between the connection of the brain and the hand, right? When we have to work through a digital interface that some other mind has created, we're essentially working through their cognitive process. When we're working just with our hands, with a pencil on paper, it's an extension of our cognitive apparatus. And so we're essentially laying our brain out without any kind of extra steps that interfere with that natural flow. So I think there's a kind of a beauty to that, but there is also a sort of intuitiveness that is very hard to overcome when you have to work through, a CAD drafting system. There's no denying the fact that CAD has facilitated the production of drawings on a building, but like, don't start there, right? Don't start with your ideas through someone else's cognitive apparatus. I'd also add that we just need to look at the distribution of nerves in our body to understand how evolution has prioritized nerve endings in our fingertips. They're also in our feet, and it's a way of interacting with the world. And so, Mark, you've mentioned, the canonical neurons, the motor neurons, the mirror neurons, all of these things that sort of like provide this cascade of hormonal release just when we see things that have been touched by a human hand. So going back to this idea that Nikos, started with, where you have these scaled elements, but if they're done by hand, people seeing that aren't really knowing why it makes them feel good, but it still does that. It does that on a sort of intuitive and a evolutionary scale, which I think is why we need more of the handcraft in the architectural and built environment. And so, starting with that pencil and starting with the paper and all those, starting with, as Zoltan said, a piece of metal that you can hold in your hand, you can understand how it kind of works as you sketch it out. I mean, that all makes just evolutionary sense. To get away from it is tragic. The other thing I'd add is that I like to think about detailed architecture as a jobs program. We had the fortunate opportunity to design more than 40 art glass windows for a biggest institutional building, and there was about 60 people working on those leaded glass windows. When you think about, if that was just sheets of glass spit out by a machine, that number of people working, and making a living for themselves is reduced dramatically. And then finally, just to your question, Mark, specifically about Scenographia, the large drawing events that we've created. We started a nonprofit, and we host these large live drawing events where we have the audience engage with the production of the drawing over the course of a few days. And people stand up on stage and they start with a blank canvas and they get to create this large composition. And there's really an interesting dynamic there that I think is reflected in the experience of the architectural environment, where people see this creation coming to life, and you can see their neurons firing as they watch other artists create these images. So
impressive. Yeah.
I think we've all felt that, as architects when we're drawing. Zoltan, it looks like you have something you want to add to this.
Yes, I put my hands up.
Yeah.
How important is the senses when you're creating something? Is not just touching or feeling or smelling, but hearing a sculpture who's holding tools in their hand, and they feel how strongly have to hit the chisel or the clay, how soft it is. But recently I just watched a movie which is created by the Hungarian Blacksmiths Guild, and it's not out yet, but they studied how a blacksmith works, and how musical instrument is an anvil, and how they communicate in the workshop with noises, with the ring of the anvil. And the whole video is about 40 minutes video, and I really enjoyed it. There is a violinist behind it and playing music by the rhythm, and how 3 or 4 people, the strikers and the master, can work together just following the rhythm, and how they can speed up the work, how they can communicate where to hit, listening the ring of the anvil. So all of the senses when you're creating something, very important, and it's not just proportionally watching a design, but when you're creating, you are 100% involved in that creation. That's what I want to add to it.
When we walk into an old building that we're going to renovate, sometimes we knock on the wall to find out if it's solid or hollow. So that's, I think, the architectural equivalent of that. But I do want to mention, regarding the other senses, to something that Anne had said. We engage visually with our environment, obviously, but I think there's a pithy way for lay people to help them understand what the visual environment does to us, and that's effectively hearing and smell. I think we all understand that bird song is something that's agreeable to most people, provided it's not some crow cawing, but bird song indicates that the forest is safe, right? If the birds wouldn't be chirping if there was a predator around, or if they were dead from some toxin, right? So evolutionarily, we understand that birdsong is a place, makes us feel safe. And then pleasant smells. I think we all kind of agree that sulfur is not so pleasant and apple pie is. So, there's an evolutionary basis there for pleasant smells. People like to smell flowers and they don't like to smell garbage, so those I think are pithy ways to describe to lay people how this evolutionary basis in our senses speaks to our experience of the environment.
So Richard, I think I just want to make sure everyone is part of the
Sure, sorry.
conversation here. And there are a few questions coming through the chat. There's some, very supportive questions and comments. And there are a few questions that are taking this as this discussion as a blanket statement that modernism might be bad. And I think you might be a good person to address this because the photos you showed in your slideshow, aren't necessarily classical buildings. And I don't think that what Nikos is saying is that every building has to be classical. I think we just can learn from, this accumulated knowledge and the science that shows us how our brains are working when we experience a space to design things differently. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to look like everything that's come before. And I'm wondering if you could just address that comment a little bit.
Sure. I mean, I think the basic statement is that nature is not art. So although, we've evolved our visual systems to have this natural thirst for seeing, nature's fractal patterns, it's not everything. And so, I think what we've been talking about today is there's almost two waves of aesthetics. There's the first wave, the biological one. And like everyone has talked about, this is a cascade of automatic processes that unfold in milliseconds. So the neuroaesthetics, we've decided before we even know what we're looking at, whether we've liked it or not. And there's no fighting that. That is happening before we even engage cognitively. But that's not everything, so there is a second wave. There is the cognitive wave when we can intellectualize about things. But I think what all the research is showing is that that's really the icing on the cake. An awful lot of what goes on with our aesthetics is inevitable. And our research has shown, from 2 years old, that infants are displaying all of these preferences that, like I said, and we can quantify aesthetics and show that it leads to a 60% reduction in stress, which is a huge amount. So we've got this natural symbiotic relationship with nature that we've been ignoring, for many, many years. And it's just bizarre from an evolutionary point of view. But we're not animals. And like I say, nature is not art. So there is room for all of this second wave of cognitive aesthetics. And I think that's the beauty. A lot of what we've been talking about today is about interdisciplinary collaboration. And if any of you can remember the sort of original fractal patterns that came out in the 1980s, produced purely by mathematicians, they were pretty horrendous looking things, and so, you've got to have that sensibility or collaboration between architects and designers, psychologists and mathematicians to get it absolutely right. But I think that's why I'm so excited about this. You can call it a challenge, but it's a fantastic opportunity as well. And I see it as this balance between the neuroaesthetics and that second wave of more intellectual aesthetics.
Nikos,
excuse me, Melissa, I see there's Alejandro Planas who has his hands up for a long time.
Hello. I'm glad that I'm glad about this whole discussion. I really agree with most of the points being discussed here, but there's something that I did want to ask, and it's a shame that Victoria is not present at the moment, because last year I did an article with her and we discussed a very similar subject. So here's the thing, Nikos, in your presentation, one of the pictures that was put as your work was a hospital courtyard, right? designed in a more traditional way. And this brings me a bit to a subject which is, I think, important to discuss. And that's, so hospitals today are designed in such a way that they're so stressful that they might even conflict with the way that people heal, because stress stops the person from healing. However, there also needs to be a consideration to be made. And why is it that hospitals are usually so ugly? It's because they're meant to be the most sterile environment they can be. And usually stone and wood and things like that are porous so they can absorb germs. And this is where my question sort of comes about, and that is, what could be done in order to integrate this newfound functionality that needs to take into consideration the advancements of germ theory and all this knowledge with the traditional elements and understanding that we're carrying over and trying to build upon, as well as the crafts, because ultimately a sterile environment and crafts are usually not really associated to one another, but what could be done in order for us to bring those two worlds together and create hospitals and environments that are more healthy, not just in appearance, but in functionality and helping people recover.
If this is a question for me, Melissa, can I answer the question?
Yes, and I suspect that maybe Matt might have some thoughts on this too. I know, but yeah, go ahead.
And Don as well. Yeah.
Well, to take a stab at answering it, today's hospital design goes back to the shoe last factory designed by Walter Gropius that has absolutely nothing to do with a healing experience. The courtyard I drew was a medieval hospital where actually you get a healing experience from the geometry. So today's hospitals for the last 40 years or 50 years have had nothing to do with healing or with efficiency. It's just a copy. It's just a mental copy of an image of Walter Gropius. This is a cult, religious cult image that is copied over and over again. Secondly, now, especially during COVID, the data shows that wooden surfaces, plastic surfaces, metal surfaces have absolutely very little difference in antiseptic qualities. Raw copper is antiseptic because of the copper itself. But what do you have now? What you mentioned is the Bauhaus propaganda that said, "Look, this is shiny, it's nice, it is clean, it is sterile." Absolutely not. You, with disinfectant spray, you can have the same sterile surfaces by spraying in a 19th century hospital. But in the 19th century hospitals, they had nosocomial infections because they didn't know, they didn't have disinfectant sprays. This was before the germ theory was applied. So as far as the as hospital designs today, it is inconceivably stupid that following from the 1980s, when the biophilic effect was shown to help hospital healing, that hospitals have not implemented, except for Sweden, where the government itself called Roger Ulrich to come and set the guidelines for hospitals to have biophilic effects in the design, because that improves the healing of the patients. But the American hospitals, no, they just continue to copy Walter Gropius's building that was not a hospital, but a shoe last factory. That's totally stupid. That's the state of architecture today.
And I just have two things to add to that before maybe Matt jumps in. My husband is a chef, and we have visited artisanal cheesemakers in Italy who have actually proven to the European Union that the traditional methods of making the Ragusano cheese in a wooden container that was assumed to be not hygienic and would cause listeria and all sorts of problems actually is more hygienic than the stainless steel that the EU wanted them to use. And so I think this goes back to the idea of trusting generations of accumulated knowledge. I mean, we all know that some of the diets of the longest living cultures in the world are some of the healthiest, and they have the right proportions of meat and vegetables and nutrients. And so I think, we have to go back to this idea of trusting tradition sometimes. Matt?
Well, yeah, that's fascinating, Missy, and I think our ancestors earned the privilege for us to be here, right, through that tradition and experimentation. But my wife and I have been, my wife really has been dealing with stage 4 cancer. So we've had a lot of opportunity in the last few years to be in a multitude of different healing environments, hospital environments or doctors' offices. And, you know, there's over the last, I mean, we've been doing this for 6 or 7 years now, that meaning visiting these facilities. And over the last few years, we've seen a change as to this nod towards biophilia. They're doing like little leaf patterns and these kinds of things. You can see some of that science creeping in. It's still sophomoric, in my opinion. It's kind of just it's a little bit of a it's a little bit of a glance to it. It's not a full embrace of what needs to be done. But we also found that maybe much more than what we're necessarily talking about here is that there's a problem, as Nikos notes, in the precedent for these facilities, where there's a complete lack of orientation and legibility with regard to getting around and finding your way and those sorts of things, where you have these like ridiculous wayfinding patterns, and then people try to make art out of the wayfinding pattern, which makes it more confusing. They put the red next to the green so that the colorblind people can't find their way, and so on and so forth. It's just a comedy of errors is really what it is. But there's really if we followed some of the older models, I'm sure the group here is probably familiar with Sant Pau in Barcelona, the hospital facility designed by Domenici Montaner. It's a legibly and you know, rationally organized system with distinct buildings for different specialties, et cetera. It's replete with ornament. So it really embodies a lot of those elements. But I think, you know, when you talk about some of the ways that the hospital environment is trying to make a nod towards this biophilic aspect, I noted that in the waiting room of our cancer ward, the floor looked more like the Ebola amoeba, like the Ebola virus, than it did, you know, the pattern in the carpet looked like the Ebola virus. And then, like, yeah, sure, that's biophilic, I suppose, but not exactly the biology that you want to be sort of referencing in a setting where you're supposed to be healing. So
I'd like to
and I
throw in
think
something
this
about
isn't
hospitals.
about classicism versus modernism. There's an excellent TED talk by what's his name, Alan Ricks from Mass Design, about a hospital that they designed in Africa that really engaged the community in the craft of building it with local materials, and really dug into understanding the culture and what people were going to respond to, and what was going to make people in that community, what was going to help them to heal. So I do see a ton of hands up, and I don't want to, I'm sort of doing a terrible job here because we're behind on our timing. And I know that some of the questions that you're going to ask are going to be equally as relevant after we watch Don's movie. So I'm going to suggest that we move on to the movie screening, and then we will save your questions and we will acknowledge your hands when we get to the open discussion after the movie, if that's okay with everyone. And Nir, I don't know how it is that we are sharing the movie, so I'm handing it back to you.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for this really fantastic set of comments. I think the elephant in the room is that actually the classical orders and the classical method, which underpins all of the traditional architectures of all the world, actually, literally address all these questions. And you know, at the end of the day, the kind of literacy that John Hay is teaching and so on and so forth is the key to that, including the matter of proportions, which I really want to refer everybody to Richard Salmon's understanding of proportions, because it takes you to the point of understanding that it's not just Fibonacci, and it's not just golden section, and it's not just the vesica piscis, but it is actually a set of 7 separate proportions, each one of them fractal, each one of them a mirror of the environment of our emergence. Anyways, here comes a movie, a beautiful movie.
Okay, so welcome back, everyone, and I hope that we can have a more open conversation in this part of the segment here, and maybe include more of the questions from the audience. And I know right before we got off, Milton had his hand up, and I think while we were all taking a break, disclosed his primary question to Nir. I'm curious, Milton, if your question has changed at all after watching the movie, or I think maybe you can just launch us off here. And I hope that Flora and Tasneem will help me to monitor raised hands here. And I think people should just raise their hand and ask their question instead of me just reading them off the chat. So Milton, why don't you lead us off?
Thank you. My view hasn't changed, but that's in part because I've actually watched several of Don's videos and interviews, and they are in an area that overlaps my own work as an architect, as a teacher. So I've given it a lot of thought, and at Catholic University, where I've been teaching for 44 years, the relationship between classicism and modernism is a main topic. We just had a wonderful lunchtime seminar on it. So I listened to this movie, this building on what Don has done before. It's quite elegantly produced, but I do have the same conclusion, which is I think that it is leveraging current research in neuroscience, current valid, I think, expectations that neuroscience has a lot to do for architecture, and experts like Anjan and other people who are very, very interesting and very good at what they do, and lots of other people who were able to comment, like, well, tons of people. Nonetheless, my conclusion is that it is neuro-esque, in that I think it goes from lots of neuroscience to conclusions which are based on such a narrow fragment of neuroscience as to be not valid. For example, the parasympathetic versus the sympathetic nervous systems. Yes, the sympathetic nervous system is engaged with fight or flight at high levels of intensity, but artistic tension in painting, in music, and in architecture operates with some adrenaline at a much lower level of hormonal expression. So I have to reject entirely the argument that it is only good hormones that relate to good experiences in health and architecture, art, and music. I think to the contrary, people prefer the richness of some cognitive challenge, and that's been well established in lots of research. So I'm not immune to the arguments, but I am really more than suspicious about them. I think it ultimately blockades getting more valid insights from neuroscience into classicism. My final word on that I would like to take a moment for is that I think it's important for people who are who believe in and are really wed to traditional design, whether it's classical or other traditional design, to be proud of it and not have to beat up modernists in order to feel good about it. You've got something good going here. It's been going for a long time, but I don't think it's necessary to find arguments that are aimed at really abusing people who don't happen to agree. And I've heard too much of that, and I attend many sessions that involve classical architecture. I find much of the advocacy for traditional and classical architecture to be extraordinarily well-founded, intellectually substantial. That's what I'd like to hear more of.
Well, I agree with you. I think that the bashing modernism is not a way to make an argument for classicism, but I don't think that that's what the message of this movie was. I actually think that, we heard, and maybe I had the benefit now of watching it twice because Don kindly shared it with me so I could watch it over the weekend before this session. But I think we heard a lot about the tension between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic and how we need the combination of those two things in order to thrive. I don't think anyone's advocating for solely one or the other here. And I'm wondering, maybe Nikos, you should take the first stab here at addressing this, because I didn't hear it at all as a case for not having modernism and only having classicism. I heard it as a case for thinking about human responses to space in all aspects of design.
I agree. I think most of the movie was about that. My comments really go to the narrow conclusions that are being drawn from it about the 3x3 design, et cetera, and the human face as being the governor for good design.
Yeah, but there was a 3x3 demonstrated in an asymmetrical
but
work
it's,
of architecture,
yeah,
right?
I saw that, but I've seen the diagram before, but unfortunately it is really a stretch to apply that diagram to that building.
No,
Well, my name has been called to answer Milton, but Milton did not pose a question. Milton threw a criticism that sometimes the debate between classicists and modernists gets heated. And if you want my opinion, I don't think it's heated enough. But that's my personal opinion. I don't want to criticize Milton. As far as the Don's movie, it's full of statements that are really rather well backed up by science. And it's what is presented in the movie is the tip of the iceberg, because the people who spoke in the movie have published papers. Very few architects spoke in the movie. It's mostly neuroscientists. These are serious people. Scientists are pretty serious. It's architects who tend to blah, 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 especially about their own projects. So, you know, Milton, I appreciate you raising the fine points about the need for some interest and tension. You know, these are fine points, but I don't think that your concerns undermine the basic scientific data that have come out and that are at the base of the movie. And I think the movie is really the first step in pointing towards a new approach to design, which is evidence-based. And you may disagree with some of the details. This is an evolving field. As a scientist myself, I don't expect any radical change. I expect more and more support from science and gradual refinement, and maybe that refinement will eventually satisfy you, Milton, with, you know, with cleaning up a few, you know, important loose ends. But that's for the future to determine.
And I think, you know, Nir, I see your hand, but I also want to say that the movie does a great job in my mind of pointing out that, you know, architecture is not the same as painting, that we may occasionally want to create a building that provokes, but that there's a risk in doing that, that we have a responsibility to society to create spaces that, you know, make the majority of people feel comfortable and not anxious. And that if we can learn from neuroscience what those techniques are, that maybe we should be exploring those ideas. And I took to heart the comment, I can't remember who said it exactly, but about, you know, it's not about, you can't predict an individual's response to any one thing, but it's not about an individual's response to any one thing. It's about, you know, how the majority of people are responding most of the time. And there's of course a place for, you know, Frank Gehry's museum on the river in Bilbao. It's a beautiful, interesting thing, but if you can't make a city out of it, you can't make the world out of those kinds of spaces. So Nir, what was it that you wanted to say?
Content so much as I'm really curious to hear John Hay, and also wonder what people like Bill Westphal and Zach Kane have to say. So I'm just that. Thank you.
Well, let's give John a chance to respond, because you did not get much chance to speak in the last round. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, no, no worries. Thank you. And I noticed, I really appreciated some comments way up there, questions that Bill Westphal had posed about some of the other aspects of what it means to be human, you know, taking into account all aspects, mind, body, and spirit. Okay, but first the design starts with that human being. And multiple types of human being, both the designer, the executioner, and those who enjoy come along afterwards. I had the good luck to work with Thomas Gordon Smith for about a decade, and he was always very careful to be designing brick details and try to bring as much local craft into it as he could, so that he was still teaching, right? He was not only teaching in the classroom at Notre Dame, but teaching on the job site and learning from the craftsmen. So multiple projects that we worked on, the masons working on the site would say, thank you for these details. And they'd say, I'm taking photographs of these you know, more complex brick arches and corbelling and brick entablatures, and I'm sending it to my friend out in California, or I'm sending it out to my mason buddies in Georgia, because they don't get to work on projects like this. And so they said, I'm just really enjoying this project. So what started in the office moved out into the field. It elevated the craftsmen, and of course, then those who enjoy the building for long after continue to appreciate that. So everybody along the line participates and then carries on some kind of benefit from that. So, okay, what does it mean to be a human? We had I really appreciated Matt bringing up the hospitals and hospital design. I've got a book on my desk on painting as medicine in early modern Rome, and the hospital Santo Spirito in Rome is highlighted, specifically the Corsia Sistina. And the architecture is gorgeous, and that was all built as a hall for treating sick patients. It looks like the nave of a church inside there. In fact, now who gets to enjoy that are basically the super rich as an event hall, where it was really it was a combination of art put together for those who are suffering most. And I think this is a key aspect that we have to look at, is the vulnerable. Quick quotation from that book is that early modern patients did not pursue physical and mental healing in separate institutions. Renaissance hospitals throughout Italy had long addressed patients' corporal, emotional, and spiritual needs all together, all at the same time. So where does this all begin? It begins at birth. I know that Anne has been wonderful about her comment in a previous video about what do children draw around the world, and we saw more of that today. Always something that looks like a face. We need to keep track of the importance of the human being, as Ian McGokris said. Within 45 minutes of birth, the baby is looking to imitate facial expressions of whoever is there, right? Obviously, it would be one of the parents, but not necessarily. But the baby is looking for the human contact, the human face immediately. And this is a serious issue. If the baby doesn't get this, the baby dies or suffers. And that emotional and that neural damage is what we are way too good at neglecting. And that's a serious vulnerability in our society. I think we routinely transgress against those who suffer from mental illness. My wife just told a story. I'm sorry, this is going on a little bit long. She just told the story about our son, who's about a year and a half, year and 3 months with Down syndrome. He's very fascinated by our faces. He's always touching, always reaching out for the face. And she was in a meeting with a couple of teachers, and and she always was sitting in a chair in this conversation where our son could see her. But she said she kind of got involved in that conversation, turned her back, and immediately our son highly reacted against that. And I think there's you guys have seen probably the still face experiments on YouTube with Dr. Edward Tronick, and the interaction between a mother and a child, and how it can actually seem and look abusive only within minutes. To deny the face or to keep a plain face when a child is trying to interact with you can be a form of abuse. And I think Nikos has brought this up, and I think many have brought this up in the past, that if you create faceless images or faceless facade, we should investigate for what kind of damage that's doing, not only to the spirit, but to the soul and our interaction with who we think we are and how we relate to one another. I wouldn't be teaching at a Catholic college if I didn't bring up a theologian on this issue, Hans Urs von Balthasar from the 20th century, that a little child awakens to self-consciousness in being called by the love of his mother. It's the mother's smile that tells the child his being is good. And I think that's a multi-generational interaction, that is a face-to-face contact, and that is a moment of saying, there's something good about you. And if someone can get that point put across within 45 minutes of birth, we're well on our way to a good and solid lifetime. So take care of the people who are vulnerable, those who are not as active in these issues with us. But I do have more to say about why I think classical architecture actually is the best method of teaching, not the only one, but I would say the best method of teaching this face and this human component because it provides rules, it provides a safe room like kids like to play in, and then it allows the invention within those rules. And I think if you can provide that, then a student is able to progress on into some other, more fun, inventive types of architecture. But the classical, it puts it all out there. It's been systematized. It's in multiple treatises. And by the way, most of those treatises engage with the human face, engage with the human form. And guess when we start to lose that? Right around Louis Sullivan, when it only becomes organic. And after that, our last human figure is the modular man. And I'll end with this. Traditional classical architecture is like grown-up child's play, but for us, it's more like dancing, more like ballroom dancing. The structure, the interaction, the inventiveness you cannot do until you know the rules and you know how to play it. We need the rules in order to be able to invent. And you cannot invent in the mosh pit of the modular man.
Well, I have thank you for that. And thank you again for sharing, accumulated wisdom also through scripture. I think that's an interesting thing to think about. And, one question I have, I continue to think that this isn't really a discussion about classicism versus modernism. And I'm thinking a bit about the idea of symmetry versus balance. And I think, we can also enjoy asymmetrical compositions when we feel like they have a sense of balance to them. And I remember reading a book, and I wish I remembered who the author was, about Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture and what made him so universally appealing to people. And it was this idea that I think comes up in the video about prospect and refuge, that his buildings had a sense of giving, the occupants a sense of prospect, but also a sense of refuge. And so I'm wondering if anyone else wants to talk about different ways that these neuroscientific discoveries might play out in other forms of architecture that aren't classical.
Missy, can I jump in and respond to something that Milton had? I think he's off the call or off the conference now, but he had mentioned cognitive challenge in architecture, and I think there might be an allusion to, that's with an A, not an I, an allusion to simplicity in classical design and the kind of benefit that fractals bring to facilitating homeostasis and kind of calming our nervous system and those things. And I don't think cognitive challenge is a bad thing in architecture necessarily, but like decorum is an important thing, right? And hierarchy is an important thing. And I think we need to have an understanding as architects and designers, when to cognitively challenge and when to not challenge. I mean, it should not be used in a setting where someone's trying to heal, to like give them yet another challenge to overcome, with regard to their system. If you want to put it into a nightclub or a restaurant where they walk in and they're kind of like disoriented and it's this fun and temporary thing, that's fine, I think, but to put it in a setting where people are trying to heal, I think is actually malpractice. So that's one thing to me that distinguishes contemporary, I'll call it contemporary or so-called modern architecture from an architecture that's based in a tradition. It's that there doesn't seem to be a hierarchy in contemporary architecture, and there doesn't seem to be an understanding of decorum, when things should happen and how. And I think that those for me are bright lines as to like what defines, how we navigate this, how our bodies respond to the built environment.
Excellent points. Don, do you have any thoughts on this, since it's your movie?
I'm just the presenter here. I'm trying to really further the conversation. This is new, impactful information for the profession. And health and well-being is quickly moving, as Matt just said, into a position of being one of the criteria that we have to take into consideration as we design buildings. And as Anne so beautifully said, we'd be foolish not to look at this. And in fact, it may be malpractice. If we have information that we're designing stressful environments that are harming people, and we're not paying attention to it, I liken it to secondhand smoke issue. that kind of came to the surface a few decades ago. This is an emerging issue that architecture is going to have to deal with. And I think that with the coming of AI, robotic design, robotic construction, that we need to make sure that pleasure and beauty are part of the algorithm of solving architectural problems. It's part of our physiology. It's part of our being, homeostasis, as Matt just said. So anyway, again, the movie is just try to ignite the conversation.
And the movie, it's interesting to me that the movie does touch on multiple cultures, which I think is something that we should talk about a little bit. Doesn't go super deep into it, but what's interesting to me, or what would be interesting to me about more research in that regard, is that it's the neuroscience research here is trying to play to the things that make us more the same instead of highlighting the things that make us more different, which inherently maybe helps to bring people together around certain ideas. And Anne is shaking her head. Maybe she has something nodding. Maybe you have something to add to that. But I find it interesting that, you know, in this society which is so divisive and where, you know, there's sometimes an assumption that people of different cultures need a totally different architecture. But then when we're all living in a global environment, everywhere can't and probably shouldn't be the same either. And, you know, it just occurs to me that there may be something here that helps to bring us together rather than drive us apart.
Yeah, I think what I see with my students at the Boston Architecture College, I'm teaching remotely. So I'll have students in like Dubai and students in Bangladesh at the same time with Canada. It's amazing. And what I'm seeing is young people are so interested in understanding humans. And they're so interested in a way, understanding the paradox of where we are now. On the one hand, we have fantastic technologies the world has never seen. On the other hand, when you start applying them to human nature, you realize we still are a primate. Our brains and body have not evolved for 40,000 years. It's the same brain. And you also see that traditional classical architecture fits the brain, fits our imperative for storytelling, fits our imperative for face-like facades, fits our imperative for all these imperatives you might not realize you have, you know, for organized complexity. It fits us the way modern architecture does not. You can have compassion for why modern architecture happened. Having all these new game-changing technologies was amazing. We wanted to just use them. But then we didn't understand how the human experience is subliminal and visceral. We didn't understand that cognition actually starts viscerally in your body. When you see an iPhone on a heavy table in the Apple store, your brain implicitly tells you that must be an important thing. It's on a heavy table. You know, they didn't understand when they came up with modern architecture how humans actually worked. And now we do. So we're in this funny position where we have all this high technology to really understand how in some ways we're incredibly complex primitive organisms. So we have to bridge that. And I think that's why this film is brilliant about showing this opportunity that we have to kind of bridge this. And as I said in my earlier comment, what's scary to me though, because I have worked with some of these technologies for 5 years, is how Honda, BMW, GM, Tesla, they use all these technologies to determine, you know, how to manipulate you. That's what they're doing. We'll be doing some new studies with iMotions Online. That's a company that's used by Tesla to determine which advertising commercial to use to sell their cars, to determine the feelings people will have about their Teslas. And that measures, without even setting up a lab, by watching you view a commercial on a screen, it measures your facial expressions, combining it with your eye tracking. And they'll use that to select the advertisement you're going to go see when you watch a movie. I mean, it's just amazing where we're at right now. And the fact that architecture is just not in the same world that the people are in designing the Kellogg's, you know, Raisin Bran package is amazing to me. That's a little bit striking to me. They know, the people at Kellogg's designing the Raisin Bran, they know it's a primitive brain, hasn't changed for 40,000 years. So there's going to be a smiling sun looking at you as you look at the package. And they've designed everything with neuroscience. And when you apply those same tools to modern architecture, what's fantastic is modern architecture really does collapse if you take people out of the car. Modern architecture works kind of when you're driving to it in a car, but if you try to walk, which unfortunately is what our primitive bodies are designed to do, you really cannot walk around modern buildings with the same ease as traditional streets. Anyway, I could go on, but that's the exciting thing, to kind of bring the two centuries together, the 21st century and the thinkings from the 20th, and to bridge it. We're really at this incredible inflection point. And I think that's why Don's movie is so important. He's kind of bringing that to the fore. There could be many more movies too. It's a foundation for future education and more movies as well.
Melissa, can I jump in? Can I jump in here? I want to offend my good friend Nir. The Alexandrian approach to architecture does not specify a style. So when you go through Christopher Alexander's books, you see some classical buildings, but you see an enormous variety of buildings from all over the world. And we have
That's a huge error.
Near
anything you see, no, by definition, that's a modernist position. Anything you see is a style. If it's replicable, for sure, because it is a shape grammar. So anybody who says that they are not stylistic is simply not stating a fact. Sorry,
you are abusing your position to cut me off. And I want to say, the person who realized
I am.
Who realized the importance of the Alexandrian approach is here with us. Lucien Steil, 20 years ago, realized that classicism could be embedded in a broader spectrum of the Alexandrian approach, and he published the Catharsis series of online journals. And Lucien, please tell us something.
Okay, yeah, I mean, thank you, Nikos. And we actually also, Nikos, with Michael Mehaffey, we created an organization, we created a non-profit workshop. You remember that? We have in Luxembourg registered non-profit organization, which is called Catharsis Urban Workshops, which has not really operated that much, but it's still alive, But I wanted to say something, sorry. So this has been a really, really fantastic session, and you were all really, really amazing. And Nikos, I mean, I love you. You are so sparkling and so passionate, and it's just getting worse and worse. You know, you get more and more excited. It's really fantastic. And it's also so great to see you empowered, because I remember when we talked, the first time, there wasn't really, we talked about how, and that's something I wanted to address, how the modernists actually were using science in an abusive manner. So they actually refer to science all the time. So the constructivists used the chaos theory and complexity theories to in some way add a scientific argument to their work. And I was asking Nikos, do you really see any evidence that chaos or complexity theories are embedded in modernism? And he said, no, I see it more in traditional architecture. So that's how we started the conversation. One thing I would like to say about the film and about everything we have been talking today, I'm a little bit wary about the insistence on the visual aspect, you know, that everything kind of gets in some way reduced. So it's the mother's face, it's all the, so in some way, I think it's definitely an important thing, and we communicate through visuals. But I think in architecture, good architecture, and we know it from, you know, I know when we have been talking with students, and then when students tried to get a grant, when I was teaching, and some students wanted to have a travel grant, and then the commission, you know, the grant commission said, why don't you can find, we have plenty of books in the library. And then the students say, no, I want to see the building. I want to touch the building. I want to walk into the building. So it's not only a photo, it's not only a scan, it's not only, so it's an experience, a multi-sensory experience, which is, of course, very difficult to articulate, but it's something which is a little bit missing in now, not in the neuroscience debate, because I've seen I was actually using a book in one of the class I taught with a psychologist at Notre Dame, and was a work with this guy from Finland. What's his name? Very famous. He's not a neuroscientist, an architect from Finland, and he writes.
Palasma, Johanni Palasma.
Exactly. Yeah. So Palasma, and then other people. There's also Susan Robinson. I think she's talked about nested bodies, embodied mind, and so there is a lot of other senses which kind of enter into the appreciation and into the judgment of the architectural production. And tectonics, for example. And I think tectonics, you can make pictures of buildings which are not very tectonic, even if they are symmetrical and so on, and there are buildings which are asymmetrical and work really well. So my question is also, if General Motors are able to understand much quicker the benefit of neuroscience for their interest, what's about if the modernists understand much quicker than the classicists how they can use neuroscience for maintaining in some way the position, the privileges and the power they have in academia, like they did with green architecture. I think we talk about green architecture, ecological, sustainable. Most of the sustainability-driven architecture is kind of dominated by the modernist establishment. So how can we make sure that we use neuroscience intelligently and we make it in some way ours in a very holistic way, not only just kind of in a number of face recognition or very kind of, in some way, I find simplified scientific experiments.
I'd like to make some comments, if I may. This has been a very informative presentation for me. I've been skeptical of Nikos's work and that of Christopher Alexander and others, because it concentrated so fully on the appearance of things, with the reward coming to the pleasure of those people who experience it, that it seemed to emphasize perhaps only the part of architecture that Vitruvius refers to as delight. We have had a serious error for the last couple of 100 years. This is not going to be news to some of you. You've heard me say it before, but I'll say it again this time. We've had a serious mistake in understanding Vitruvius, who is talking about commodity, firmness, and delight as the art of building, edificare, edificando. And he goes on later to, or actually about the same place, and he says architecture is also about symmetria, eurythmia, and decor. And symmetria we misread. I'm sure Nikos knows about this, that symmetry as bilateral symmetry is a development in mathematics in the 18th century. And what Vitruvius is talking about is symmetria, that is to say, the proportionality of beauty and good and true in nature. And what he's advocating in symmetria is to use a word that is forbidden in modernism, the imitation of nature. So the beauty of nature is imitated through symmetria, refined for eurythmia, in order to serve decor. And decor means what you've been talking about here with hierarchy and so on. It's to serve that which is most important, with a hierarchy among buildings that indicate what's most important. For what? Most important for the authority that government exercises. Without government, there's no buildings. Governments decide what will be built, and it decides who will be building, because what's built goes on the land, and the government is in charge of the land. So what Vitruvius says in the introduction to his book is, Augustus, you've done really great things. Let me build you things that increase your greatness and demonstrate your greatness, express your greatness to others. Now, this meant that architecture became the instrument of authority. And for a couple of thousand years after that, well, 1500 or so, the authority was exercised primarily by the church. And now we get to Alberti and the beginning of what I think is the modern age. And in the introduction to his book, he says, the role of the architect is to serve the good that is defined by the citizens. It depends upon the kind of regime we have, because he worked for dukes and they did good things, so he'll work for them. He worked for aristocrats, they good things, he'll work for them. And he worked for democratic organizations, and he'll do good work for them because they serve the common good. And that becomes the role of the architect. But he also says, before taking on a job, discover whether you're working for serves the common good or his own good. And if he's only serving his own good, don't work for him. In other words, the choice that the architect makes goes to for whom will he exercise his authority. And that is the introduction of individuality, and hence of the modern, into the role of architecture among the arts. Now, you've mentioned earlier Diderot, and this is the wonderful essay by Ernst Cassirer that defines the modern system of the arts, and allies, as you pointed out, as somebody pointed out, allies architecture with painting and sculpture and theater and music. But that separates it from its role in serving the authority of the good. And so one of the programs that is developed from that position is that it is grasped by revolutionary architects and revolutionaries to use it to justify their authority. And here you have 19th century eclecticism. And what is missing here is the continuity of the traditional architecture of classical architecture, or any traditional architecture, in serving the nation, serving the good that the nation seeks. And that's something Thomas Jefferson understood. And that's the foundation of American architecture. And it flourished up into Bauhaus and Harvard. So it's separate from the rest of architectural history. Now, if we're trying to figure out where to put the wonderful material that has been presented in this session, where to put it in the architectural curriculum, I think it needs to go in two places. One is within architectural theory, and the other is in architectural history. Now, I don't need to say much more about architectural history, because I've said it in a book that is just published on the 31st of January, jointly written with Samir Yunus at Notre Dame. I'll show you a picture of it. Here it is. Probably can't see it, but it's available. And what it does is to present the history of architecture, or that is, it's a prolegomenon. It tells you how to do a history of architecture, not as a history of styles, not as a succession of eras, each of which has its own history, but rather as certain idea building types that serve one of the very few purposes that governments serve. And the other is how to render character, which is that which people recognize. They recognize in a person, they recognize in a building. It tells them what this is for, how to encounter it, how to use it, what to expect from it. And these are rooted in national traditions and national customs. What we plan to do, or what somebody needs to do, is to write a new historical narrative based upon that book. So I suggest, if you have a project you want to undertake, get the book, read it, and write it to outline your own national history and incorporate all of this wonderful visual material that provides the pleasure that can lead to the decorous use of architecture. Okay, that's the end.
I wanted very shortly, so I'm very short, because I wanted to talk about education also, because I wanted to ask, how can this be, following up on Bill's, talk, how can this be really integrated in the case of education of architects? How can this become really integrated part of a curriculum? And I don't think that it should be part of the history or theory. I think it should be really more in an interdisciplinary context where it's taught really with neuroscientists and psychologists and with science, so that it's not.
It's tremendously unfortunate that the new modernist architecture based on technology was introduced at a technology institute, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Shortly thereafter, it was moved to where it ought to be, which is in a university which emphasizes the liberal studies, which means that but it strayed away from that. Fisk Kimball was a superb humanist, but Walter Gropius was not. So that architecture needs to be understood in the same way that Alberti and Vitruvius did, as the work of a citizen who is serving the common good. Is that what you were saying, Lucian?
Excuse me? No, I just said, it should enter in the education. I was teaching a class for 4 years with a psychologist, that we did the class which was called Architecture Which Hurts, Architecture Which Heals, and we went to prisons, and we found out that the architecture of prisons is really the paradigm for a lot of public architecture, for schools and for for elderly homes, and but we did it in a very empirical way, and we did readings with the students, and it was an interdisciplinary class where there were architects and non-architects, which I think was very, very helpful. And actually what was very interesting is that the architecture students were the most resistant. As has been shown or talked before when you talk about beauty, when, the perception of beauty, the more people are indoctrinated in architecture settings, the more they deviate from common sense and, the general or popular understanding of what a beautiful environment is about.
I don't think it's any accident that we heard from several people today who are teaching traditional architecture in Catholic institutions. And I think it's no accident that two major Catholic institutions, Notre Dame and Catholic University, are places where they teach traditional architecture. It makes perfect sense because they understand the role of hierarchy, they understand the role of authority, and they understand the importance of the good as the primary activities that we engage in life to achieve fulfillment. I'm not Catholic, I'm an Episcopalian, which some consider to be a failed Catholic, but it's deeply enmeshed in the American traditions that come from England, which broke away from the Catholicism. Well, you don't need a history lesson.
May I? Yeah.
Oh yeah,
Melissa?
because I just wanted to say, Lucian, that I agree with you. I think it's really important, and I think was one of the big messages of this movie, is that architects need to move out of their silos and need to start to engage with, the general population and what they think and understand to be beautiful and useful, and need to engage with other disciplines and learn from them. There's this whole tradition of architects sort of being seen as a jack of all trades and master of none, and that's really dangerous. They can't just pick up a discipline and figure it out themselves. We really need to engage with other experts in their fields and how that can inform us better about architecture. Nikos, go ahead.
Yes, I have an answer for Lucien. Members of my group around the world have already started to teach this material in courses, and the material is taught in a combination studio and theory together, and all these techniques and the VAS is available. 3M Corporation makes available 10 free scans to anyone around the world, so someone in Indonesia can profit from it. They don't have to buy the license. So people are starting to teach. Several thousand students interested in India starting the semester. People now interested in Brazil after the huge success of the film that we premiered the beginning of the week. So I have absolutely no hope for education in the United States because it is set in a rigid curriculum that's impossible to change. The NAAB has all the schools tied up in chains. They will not allow them to add a single course for credit. 3 years ago, a group of us tried to change the NAAB in the proper way by begging, politely sending recommendation requests. We were slapped in the face. Nothing changed. So forget it. In the United States, everything is lost. But American students can, as well as any student around the world, can teach themselves this material when they discover it. So my friends and I have put in quite a deal of work to make available free resources for any student around the world to learn this material and these techniques. I think this is my personal solution to the problem of educating the next generation of architects. Now, I know Lucien is doing wonderful stuff in Belgium with the Center for Architecture there, hands-on experience. So these are the flames of light that hold hope for training the new generation of architects.
So Milton, your hand is up again, and I just want to encourage others too. I'm trying to scroll through here and look for hands that are up. If you would like to speak or ask a question, please do. We are already over our scheduled time, but I'm happy to stay for a bit and continue the conversation as long as others.
I just have one quick comment.
Yeah.
I'm seeing I live in Greater Boston. I'm seeing all these new public schools going up. And they're basically brick and glass boxes. And I said to a colleague, why are they doing this? And the idea that there's another way of building, people just don't realize it. They just don't know. So what's getting built, I mean, it's just horrifying. They look like factories. And the other thing that I'm seeing is that the private schools here, I live in Concord, Mass, where there's some famous private schools like Concord Academy, where Carolyn Kennedy sent Jacqueline. The buildings are beautiful. They're traditional architecture, beautiful campus. There's also the Middlesex School, absolutely gorgeous buildings. So now what's happening is the rich who can afford to send their junior high or high school student to a $65,000 a year school goes there and has a beautiful experience. And the general public goes to a building that it's terrifying. It looks like a factory. It's horrifying. You often don't know, parents in a new school they recently built here, they don't know where the front door is. Yeah, and it's just, so it's really bizarre. So there's a big gap. The public doesn't know that there's another approach. They don't realize there is another way of building you can do. And someone just said to me, Anne, people don't know how to lay bricks anymore. Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
So this person was an engineer who told me that. He said, people don't know that. He's a lead consultant. People don't know how to do that anymore. So the idea that there is another way, people don't realize it. So that's why this conference is important. Over 100 people have been on the call. But in general, I'm seeing the reality I think of as possible. Most people don't think of as possible. That's not what's getting built in Massachusetts today.
There's
Yeah,
a
the
can I just speak to this a little bit, because I do build schools and university buildings, and I think you're right. And I think part of it is a big misperception that this beauty is not affordable. And, you know, we go to interviews all the time and we have people challenge us on the cost of our buildings, and we're able to actually prove out that it is affordable and it can be accomplished if you are clever about the way you allocate the budget. And, you know, it's like a hierarchy of allocation of budget, among other forms of hierarchy that are important here. But sometimes we even get pushback on that after we've proven it. People say, oh yeah, but you know, it still looks too expensive. So I don't care if it actually was too expensive. It looks too expensive, and I can't have my constituents or my board or my whatever think that I spent too much money on this thing. And so I think there's all kinds of communication that we have to do, not only to show that there are alternatives, but to show that those alternatives can be affordable. And, you know, sometimes that's by mixing together technologies for construction that are more mechanized together with things that are more handcrafted, which is how we were able to achieve such wonderful effects with Zoltan and his work on the Yale colleges. So Milton, yes, your hand is up. I see it. Go ahead.
Before I give Nico some hope about American architectural education, I just want to mention that I've designed about 35 schools, including some recently that got some notice. The U.S. Commission of Fine Arts approved an addition to an historic site with 2 historic buildings in Georgetown and Washington, D.C. If you want to see what I've done, Don has shown us his, I'll show you mine, shinberglevinas.com, SHINBERGLEVINAS.com. And I invite you to see it. I'd love to have a dialogue about it. So Nico's, at the Catholic University of America, where I've taught since 1977, in 1980, they gave me the freshman studio, and for 10 years, I integrated beginning with a number of works that you're probably familiar with in the neuroscience of art and the neuroscience of architecture realm, taught freshmen this material. And we did 3-dimensional studies, and they went off into their upper studios, better prepared in many ways than their forebears who used the Bauhaus basic design course, which I didn't think was effective. So that's one thing. When that course ended, shortly after, they gave me the opportunity to teach a course to graduate students called Beauty and Brains. That's about neuroscience and architecture and integration into design. And that also made its way into a studio as a project that was not visual, called there we go, thank you, which was called A House for a Blind Composer. And if you look at what Nir's just posted on the upper left, I don't know if Nir can raise that, but the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts and the Georgetown panel accepted a terracotta building that was not in traditional vocabulary, but traditional materials. Maybe that'll come up. In any event, that's my comment, and I just want to give you some hope, Nikos, that there is a path.
Milton, if I may answer, I don't see any hope. You are a good person who did wonderful things, but in only one architecture school in the United States. All the rest, minus say 2 or 3, are doing garbage. They're doing brainwashing, unfortunately. So we're producing thousands of brainwashed architecture students who will just continue to do horrible, inhuman buildings. So you being the exception is wonderful, but it's not going to change the whole thing. And I mean,
I'm happy to report Anne's in the same business, and they're actually, it's a rapidly expanding population of people who bring this into schools. So I hope, before you and I are out of the picture, there will be much more of this sensitive work being done and good dialogue. So have hope, Nikos. It's not over.
How many
I
people
have to
were
start
there
somewhere, and I
yesterday
have to say, students
involved in this? 138, something like that? And how many today? Been more than 100? And 20 years ago, there would have been 5. There would have been Dimitri, and there would have been Leon, Jack Robertson. Who else? So yeah, we're growing. But the fundamental problem that most people have when they want to understand architecture or think they know something about architecture is to be laid at the responsibility of the historians who have for 75 years told only the history of modernism, not the history of architecture. And this has to change.
My dear Bill, it is the NAAB that stipulates that schools must teach a course in modernist architecture history an entire semester, if not an entire year. Otherwise, they cut the accreditation.
Absolutely.
It is the threat by the bully.
That is a citadel that must be assaulted.
We have assaulted it and we came back licking our wounds.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I know that the NAAB has been trying to change their way of looking at curriculum at architecture schools to allow more flexibility or more differentiation between them. And I also understand that some people think that the changes they've made have not been so successful, but in their defense, I think they may be trying. And so don't give up on them.
Lisa, I remember that John Stamper, he was saying that the accreditation, they had cut history classes from 3 hours to 1 hour. And in this 1 hour, they actually insisted on modern, but also world architecture. So just packing into 1 hour, not only Western modern architecture, but the world architecture without defining exactly what that means. You know, what does it mean, world architecture? But they reduced the number of hours, and also they cut the necessity of having a library. So there's the architecture schools don't have a library anymore, except Notre Dame. Nobody has a library anymore.
Notre Dame managed to finesse it some years back when the NAAB came. They went through the accreditation. We were able to pass everything except one thing. We did not have code compliance for exiting, emergency exiting. Sorry, we do. You just didn't see them.
Yeah, I think things have changed a bit since then. I don't want this to become a conversation about the NAAB because I don't think that's terribly useful, but they did come and make a presentation to the AIA Large Firm Roundtable that I sit on. And I think some of their changes in cutting things down were actually to cut out requirements to give schools more flexibility to put in the things that they felt were important. And I think they were misconstrued by some of the schools as being cuts to the things that they felt were important. And so hopefully that will play itself out over the coming couple of years and rotations through that.
Well, listen, I have one quick idea, Melissa. If you guys have examples of beautiful new schools that have been built in traditional ways, send me those images, because we're doing a biometric study with the latest cutting edge tools, and we want to show people for health and well-being for young people entering these new buildings or walking by these new buildings will be better for them. So I have a lot of examples here of these modernist blocks that are just completely dissociative when you approach them. And I can get those pictures, but I don't have any pictures of new good school buildings. If you have any, send them to me, ann@thehappy.org. And I can actually do a biometric study to show the kids will actually be healthier, even looking at the new buildings you're making.
Show Melissa DelVecchio's dormitories at Yale.
That would be, if I have the rights, we have to have the rights to the photos. And if someone can send me any pictures that they have the rights, and preferably not in the snow. It just snowed here, but it'd be great because we got to get people really thinking about health and well-being and attachment and how positive attachment happens viscerally with the old buildings and can't with the new glass structures. There's so much glass being put in new buildings. It's terrible.
I'm sure others will be happy to do that with you too.
If you could send that to me, it'd be very exciting. And because we need a foundation to enter in the science.
So
We
that's
did
an interesting segue, because I want to talk about photos for a minute, and this idea of the media kind of warping or shaping the population's responses to certain kinds of design and what is beautiful. And I'm remembering, and I'm sure John and Matt remember too, Dennis Jordan and his always saying that photos always lie, right? That sticks in my head every time I visit a building that I've looked at in photos for years. And then I visit the place and it looks like the picture, I suppose, but my experience of it is nothing like what I thought it would be. Like the scale is very different, or the way you approach it is very different. And, you know, it happens with modernist buildings. It happens to me with traditional buildings all the time. And I'm curious, you know, a lot of this visual stuff that you've shown is overlaid on photographs. Hard to tell from the presentation, actually, whether because we're in 2D here, but are you using this software in a 3D environment, or are you using this software on photographs, and does it make a difference in the perception?
We are using the software on photographs and on sketches and on paintings of facades. In cases where the difference is huge, like 80%, you get that difference. It's shocking. Now, for finer points, you can use photographs, but you have to get pieces. You have to get pieces of the photographs. And of course, the photographs don't show everything. You need to have the person on site to get the full sensory experience. Whatever we have talked about now.
But in general, yeah, I don't mean to interrupt you, but in general, we've done all three. And because we are such a visual species, photos aren't that bad. The problem with doing an actual study where you put the building in front of we put a person in front of the building is a car can go honk or a fire engine can go by, and that will completely skew the results. So in some ways, just looking at photographs is actually incredibly important. It's not the same as a 3D, but it's not that different. Because we're just such a visual species. It's pretty good. And actually the VAST software, it automatically shows basically how people will look. The iMotion software, trust me, Honda, BMW, Tesla wouldn't be using it if it didn't work.
Yeah.
The hard copies are extremely brilliant. And that's what scares me too. They really understand the human visceral experience and design to it, whereas the architects don't know how to talk about that.
Right.
And that's terrifying.
Let me add something for Melissa. When you actually come to designing a building, the software is extremely important for the beginning stage. So you make 10 sketches. You can do it on a computer or by hand. You make 10 sketches and the software tells you which one is the best one. But then in order to get it really right, in the classical traditional tradition, you go on site and you take styrofoam panels and you have people hold the panels, because the human mind then has 1,000 different sensors, and even 5 centimeters of moving this will make a huge difference. That is the method used by Louis Sullivan, by the ancient Greeks, by the Romans, by everybody, but it has not been used by anybody for decades.
Does that translate at all to virtual reality? Does it, when you have virtual reality glasses on, does your body respond the same way?
People who are like us are now getting into virtual reality to get part of that experience. So virtual reality adds the other experience. So far, nothing is as good as on-site, because on-site you have even more influence than the virtual reality. The virtual reality is still a simulation that cuts out 80% of the stimuli.
So I'm curious, yeah. I do also want to just ask a little bit on this vein about Instagram and media shaping our perceptions of beauty. And the thing that I keep wondering about is whether you could have a very anxiety-producing building, let's say, but when someone reduces it to the picture that they've decided to take and format in that little square that they post on Instagram, are they somehow transforming that into something that is no longer anxiety producing in that one little photograph that then leads people to have a different sense of a sense of perception there. So Nikos and Anne, I'd love to hear you address that question. And then I see Nir raising his hand, so we'll get to him.
Yeah, Anne, go ahead.
Well, it depends. I think that often with like TikTok and some of the Instagram things, people sometimes put in other faces or other things. You know, TikTok always has people. And so that's why I think people are just fascinated looking at it. But generally, I'd say it doesn't really work. I have my students do the postcard test, go to like the Harvard Coop and find the postcards on display of Harvard. It's fascinating. They're all the Georgian buildings. There's no Corbu building, even though no postcard of that, no Gropius building. Why? Because I'm sure there may have been at one time, but they don't get sold because it's a quick subliminal thing, right? So Harvard also makes placemats. Any modern building on Harvard placemats? Zero. All Georgian traditional, the 200-year-old buildings. That's what defines Harvard's identity. You know, it's that same subliminal brain. I'm not sure I answered your question, but I think, I don't know, once you start, there's incredible power to these tools that I cannot underestimate. Perception is reality. And when you use these biometric tools, just like when you use a microscope or use a telescope, you have a different perception. You suddenly understand things differently. And you understand why the car companies are doing them, why Tesla is doing facial expression analysis and eye tracking before it releases its ad. Incredible. They shouldn't need that. They can hire the best designers in the world. No, they use that. And once you play with these technologies, you'll see that. And the fact is, 3M visual attention software, which Nikos spoke about and he gave a good talk about, is now, as of, I think it was October 2020, became a plugin for Photoshop and Illustrator, Adobe products. Most architects don't know those products are even there. They don't know what they do. They don't know that attention happens at two levels, pre-attentively, subliminally first, and then consciously. They don't know that the unconscious is actually the root of all conscious behavior afterwards. But Adobe bought it, you know? It's amazing. So there's this disconnect between AI coming into architecture, and because Adobe sells that as an AI add-in plugin, and architects knowing what's going on. It's just completely, and what you mentioned too, VR is definitely coming to architecture as well, virtual reality, and then using this AI technology in the VR. But in a way, it's like the problem when doing architecture and not drawing anymore. It becomes all disconnected. You can tell the buildings in Boston that were built on CAD, they feel disconnected. You can really tell it, and you just get disconnected.
Well, you need all the tools. I mean, I see technology coming closer to drawing again. I mean, I spent most of the pandemic drawing on a tablet so I could easily transmit things to my colleagues or draw on the screen together with them. And I think somehow these things are going to come together, but we need to use all the tools in our tool belt, because it's also really interesting to me that now we can drop ourselves anywhere on a site and see what the perspectival experience of that is. So I think, you know, we need to do all of these things together, use the technology instead of letting the technology use us. But
Yes, Melissa, if I may say that after ruining architecture for decades, we are using the latest technology, at least our group is using the latest technology to make us human again, to let us appreciate the beauty of the hand-drawn sketch. But we apply the latest technology to actually create the building. And maybe there's some brickwork, great, you know, but the rest of the building is the latest technology. But it feels wonderful. We appreciate the human feeling thanks to technology. This conference is possible thanks to technology. All my books are published thanks to technology.
We are well over time. So does anyone have any last thoughts or questions from
our great leader, Nir?
Well, guys, I'm actually the follower of you all, if anything. And I think I have picked from every single one of you here some really great idea that I think together makes a wonderful mosaic. And I'm very grateful to all of you. Just with regard to the last thing, you know, the technology has been here. It has strong pros and strong cons. One strong pro is that, yes, you can use photographs. It's a really great way to do it because, number one, the processing occurs in the brain in 50 milliseconds. So that's about as long as it takes you to actually, for your brain to have seen something without you being cognitively aware of it. So a photograph represents that period of time, so it's good enough. Number two, your eye, the lens in your eye is conical, so VR is only going to take you so far until it starts adjusting for that. And I'm not sure how they do it or if they do it. Number four, what Nico said about going and building on site, the mock-ups and so on, you know, Melissa, very well, that things look very different on site and height looks taller than it did in the drawing and things like that. That has to do with the lens in the eye and so on and so forth. With regard to actually, the classical is not just styles, it's actually a method. And that's where we completely miss the mark. Yeah, there are orders, and we design orders for every single project fresh. It's not, there's no copying at all in the classical method. It's actually called invention. You take the technology, it's called an order, and you apply it to a new context. That is what invention is. There's no something from nothing in the universe. So this kind of invention, and you've encountered it a billion times, everybody here who actually works on buildings is taking something, an idea, whatever, and adjusting it to a location. So this technology, which is called the classical orders, actually has been figured out, and it didn't take 1,000 years to figure out. It was something like 50 years. From the moment the Greeks understood that truth, goodness, and beauty are one thing, and the construction of the Parthenon was 50 years, maybe 100, not longer. It's actually a method of thinking. This whole session wasn't about styles, supposed to be. It was supposed to be about the act of creation. And there's no creation without thinking. You just can't do it. You can't move your hand without thinking about it first, unless it's a whatever, you know. I want to bring us back to what is the act of creation? How does it work? In the old days, I'm talking Egyptian, and this is at the end of my book, the last chapter in my book is called A City of Makers. And it goes back to the creatives back then, that were compared to gods. They were demiurges. And the god Ptah, the Egyptian god Ptah, actually carried 3 symbols that represent truth, goodness, and beauty. And so many ideas came to the Greeks from the Egyptians. Apparently, that's yet another one of them. This whole business of creativity is really a function of human adaptations of the hand, the brain, all the, you know, the tribalism and the altruism and all these good things in mimesis. Number one, there would be absolutely no culture without mimesis. So we're really looking at very, very basic things, but they are basic things for humans, different from all the other species in the universe, almost push us to some kind of dumb conclusion, like the whole evolution of humanity has been towards urban living. Because if we're going to all be living in cities in 50 years, that will have been a fact. So we're looking at really strange processes, and we're in the midst of them, both in terms of the process and of our consciousness of them. So I urge us all to become architecturally literate so you can actually wield the orders and make beautiful yourselves. Anybody can do it. Anybody, literally anybody can do it. And our students are people who have not even finished high school. It doesn't take much, because it is a system that occurred in a consensual manner. If you ever read about how the Parthenon was built, it was built consensually. Everybody was consulted, from the highest artist to the lowliest slave. And there was no really good definition then in that community between the people who were skilled craftsmen slaves or highly proficient architects, artists, whatever, sculptors are working on that. It was a very interesting moment in human history. It's not really well studied, I think, or at least not told repeatedly enough, likely. And we go back to these stories, it actually moves us forward to these huge questions we're asking. What happened to the human hand? Why can't somebody support a family by working with their hands? What's wrong with that? And I say we ought to be able to subsidize those people so that they have fulfilling lives, the same way that we subsidize airports and airplanes and container traffic in large ports and very, very large corporations and so on and so forth. All of Amazon's built on the US postal system, at least at first. It was completely parasitic on it. And now it's wanting to replace it. BFD. So we are in a position. I mean, you got to read medieval history, all of you. We've been here before. This is not the first time humanity is actually looking at issues like this. There are limits to what size entity you want entering your domicile. Right now, you have the Russians entering Ukraine. There should be a rule that no entity can enter another unless it is less than 10% of that entity they're entering. So there would not be any big box stores. It would all be mom and pop. We need to subsidize that. We need to subsidize small farms. We need to reconnect with what it is human one way or another, because the alternative is not really pretty. And I think that one of the reasons we're all here is that we recognize by extrapolation what the alternatives are. And then the question is, what do we do? So we're using science to explain to ourselves what some of these processes are, what the relationships are between these different elements. We read history in order to understand what humans do when they're in the same kind of circumstances. And I think what is most important is for us to work together and continue developing whatever it is that we're doing. So really, I want to thank everybody here, all of you, really my teachers. It's an honor to be here. And I, final round, you want to open this to the final round of comments? Melissa, thank you for letting me.
Sure. Do the panelists have a final round of comments? Have I exhausted your energy for Friday afternoon? I have to say, I've said at the beginning, I'm no expert, and I, like Bill, was a little bit apprehensive about this body of research when I first came upon it, but it's been an interesting trajectory for me to read more articles and immerse myself in it more, and it's been fascinating to listen to you all today. And I really appreciate the conversation that's been flowing in the chat with various comments and all the questions that we've been getting. So thank you everyone for hanging out late on a Friday. Do the panelists have anything else they'd like to say before we conclude?
Yes,
And
I
the
would
audience,
like to thank
everybody in the audience.
Maybe do the panelists first. I haven't been seeing many hands in the audience. Let's do that first,
Okay.
and then we'll try to get some last comments from the audience if we need to.
Thank you.
Nikos, you were speaking.
Yes, thank you, Melissa. Wonderful. You're a great coordinator. Really nice, really nice. Thank you so much. And of course, thank you, Nir, for putting out this great conference together, despite your interruptions of speakers, but that adds a piquancy to the whole proceedings to keep us awake. I have nothing else to say. Thank you.
And Don, thanks for a great film and for sharing it with me ahead of time. Maybe you could go next if you have any concluding thoughts. Oh, we can't hear you. There you go.
Thank you. It's been an honor to be with everybody, and I won't feel slighted because Nir didn't interrupt me today. So,
Anne?
I'll just say that famous quote, never doubt what a small group of people coming together to change the world can do. It's the only thing that ever has, or something like that. That famous quote. Thanks, Melissa. You were fantastic bringing people together. Thanks, Nir, for putting this together. Thank you, Nikos. I think I can still put up with you. Thank you, Don.
John, I have to say you're next, but I have to say first to an audience that all knew Thomas Gordon Smith really well. I can tell that you worked with him for 10 years. I feel like you're channeling a bit of his spirit for us. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
And, curious if you have any other thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you all. I have something written by all of you. If you've written, it's there on my bookshelf. So thank you all very much. And just to encourage you, these young students, we get a lot from the Midwest. We get a lot from farm country, and they are all to one really excited about these types of debates. Who knows what life dishes them later, but they are really trying hard. They really believe that there's something out there that is beautiful, that's good and true, and we'll see how long they hold on to that and what that turns into in their future work. But that's why I come in every day. It's those young students.
Zoltan, are you still there and have energy to have any concluding thoughts for us? Or Matt, I can't tell if you guys are there. Off having a cocktail maybe, like we all should be. Okay, any other thoughts from the audience? Raise your hands. I'm trying to scroll through here and see them. I don't see any other hands up, which means everyone's ready for a cocktail. If we were in person, we'd be doing that together. But let's just cheers to everyone for a peaceful weekend and continued, I guess, a successful third session for this conference.